So what is legal luck? Remember, when we talked about moral luck, what we talked about are cases in which, if there are any, your moral status, praiseworthiness, depend on issues that are not under your control. That was how we characterized moral luck. And now we can characterize legal luck in a way that's modeled on it. Namely, legal luck, if there is any, cases of legal luck are cases where your legal status depends on factors that are not under your control. When we discussed moral luck, the main questions we had in front of us was the question whether there is moral luck, whether there can even be moral luck. But surely, if that's the question we want to ask about legal luck, it's really uninteresting. Obviously, there is legal luck. That's just a question of legal fact, and it's a fairly basic and common one. There are many, many cases, many, many ways in which your legal status does depend on factors that are not under your control. So I have here a few examples. So clearly, the distinction between full offenses and attempted, which we'll get back to shortly, are cases of this kind. But much more generally, whenever the law takes into account causation requirements, it relies on factors that do not lie exclusively under the control of the relevant agent. And the law also takes into account, really, as if it's a non-issue most of the time, circumstantial moral luck and constitutive luck, right? So the law punishes you, the criminal law punishes you for what you do or fail to do, not for what you would have done had the circumstances been different. Sometimes the law, it seems very clear, feels a mild discomfort for these things. Sometimes does not. But anyway, clearly, if the question is there legal luck? The answer is a quick and uninteresting yes. The interesting question in the vicinity here is different. It's normative. The interesting question here is, should there be legal luck? Should your legal status be at least somewhat sensitive to factors that are not under your control? And it's quite plausible that the answer is going to be a complicated one. So it's not going to be a yes, there should be, or no, there shouldn't be, but rather maybe there should be legal luck of some cases in some circumstances and not of other cases and in other circumstances. Remember the distinction between moral luck and plain luck that may have moral significance? Well, we can draw a similar distinction here between legal luck and cases of plain luck that may have legal implications. And so our discussion is not about the latter, it's about legal luck. So for instance, which judge you get is, in most systems, for most of us, not a factor that's under your control. And yet, it may have strong influence on your legal status later on. But this is not a case of legal luck in the sense we're interested in. This is the case in which what happens is that the law responds to some kind of external luck. The fact that people are different, including judges, that's just background circumstances that the law has to somehow deal with. Perhaps it should try to fight its implications by introducing sentencing guidelines or things of the kind. That's a possibility. But it's not legal luck, it's something else. The cases we're interested in, for instance, if there's differential punishment for murder and attempted murder, these are cases in which the law itself introduces lucky factors into what determines your legal status. These are the factors that these are the cases of legal luck that we are interested in. Okay, then we have all this philosophical discussion of moral luck. What's the relation between that discussion and the discussion of legal luck? One natural suggestion is that the relation is the simple, straightforward one. Namely, legal luck is justified if and only if moral luck exists. So for instance, if it's the case that the murderer is more morally blameworthy than the attempted murderer, then they should be punished more seriously by way of criminal punishment. So that's a very natural suggestion to have. It sort of suggests itself because it's so simple. It's there for the taking, but it's still way, way too quick. And it's too quick because of a reason that we've already discussed, namely the distinction between moral blameworthiness and the appropriate response. When we talk about the law, we talk about appropriate responses. And it's possible that the considerations that regulate the appropriate responses, including the appropriate legal responses, are not limited to merely the considerations of moral blameworthiness. Even if moral blameworthiness is relevant, it's quite possible that other considerations are also relevant. The relation between moral luck and legal luck in a special domain, in a specific set of circumstances, is always, always a matter of substantive discussion. You need to know more about the criminal law, or about tort law, or about what you want to achieve with the specific legal arrangements, and what the normatively relevant considerations are for it, in order to know what the relation is between moral luck and legal luck in that domain or in that context. What you need in other terms is what we sometimes call bridge principles. These are principles that bridge the gap between morality and law, and we'll see an example of a central case in a second. All right. So the crucial thing to note about such bridge principles, as we will see, is that they are context sensitive. So it's quite possible that the right bridge principle for criminal law, or maybe for some areas within criminal law, is one kind of bridge principle, one that ties punishability very closely to moral blameworthiness. But the kind of bridge principle that's right in another context, like maybe in tort law, does not establish such a close connection between moral blameworthiness and legal consequences. We'll talk more about this in a second. I don't think there is much more to say about the relation between moral and legal luck in general. There is much more to say, but not in general. Whatever else we have to say here will be specific to much more thinly cut domains. So let's devote at least some time to this really central case of the criminal law of attempt. And remember the scenario, so there's one person who murders, the other who attempts murder, but we need to keep all other things equal. So it's not as if one of them was more determined to kill, it's not as if one was more cruel or more of a bad guy, or any other difference. All other things are equal. It's just that perhaps because the gun, there was a technical problem with the gun unbeknownst to the attempted murderer in one case. That's what explains the difference. Or maybe the paramedic arrived on the scene more quickly in one case than the other. That kind of difference. Now that case, the question whether criminal law should treat the murderer and the attempted murderer differentially, that question is a central case of philosophical and legal discussions of moral and legal luck. But you should remember that it's only a central case. It's just one example, and there are many, many others. Still, we're going to discuss it because it is a central case. As Joel Feinberg, I believe, said, and that's Feinberg right there, that it's such a central case that it's a question that every bona fide philosopher of law tries his hand at least once at. So this is now your go. It seems like when we discuss the question of the criminal law of attempt, the discussion of moral luck is clearly relevant. The question whether the attempted murder and the murderer are equally morally blameworthy seems directly relevant to the question whether we should punish them equally or not. But once again, seems relevant does not establish relevance. Once again, what we need is a substantive bridge principle, and nothing here is obvious. Let's show this. Let's show this using something like a plausible but unobvious and not uncontroversial, because everything interesting is controversial, bridge principle. And that's going to be the principle of proportionality. So here it is, at least in a rough outline. The severity of the criminal punishment should be proportional to the moral blameworthiness of the offender. You may think that that's like a basic principle in what's called retributivist theories of punishment, but it's a fairly central requirement that we require of criminal punishment across the board. So let's assume this for now. Now, obviously, there are many details that are missing here. If you're going to put forward a plausible, sort of responsibly detailed principle of proportionality, you're going to have to answer many more questions. Here are just two. You may think, for instance, that proportionality does not really require a specific criminal punishment, nor does it require kind of a range of punishments that are roughly proportional to moral blameworthiness, but merely sets an upper bound. So that really the only relevant considerations is that criminals have a right to never be punished more seriously than is proportional to their degree of moral blameworthiness. It's okay if you want to punish them less for whatever reason, but not more. That's one possible way to go on a version of a proportionality principle. Here's another question you need to answer. Do we think of the proportionality requirement as establishing an all things considered duty? Namely, that's it. When you consider all of the morally relevant considerations, you should always settle on a punishment that's proportional to the crime or to the blameworthiness for the crime. Or do we think of the proportionality requirement as merely a pro tanto requirement, namely establishing one relevant moral considerations, possibly outweighed by others, or possibly alongside others? This is going to be a crucial question if you want to put forward a proportionality requirement. It's also going to be relevant in a couple of minutes for us. We're not going to get into more details with regard to the proportionality requirement, though. Well, how does something like the proportionality requirement influence the law of attempts? Here's a natural argument to put forward. Let's assume that first, we're going to assume in the opposite direction in a second. Let's assume first that there is no moral lack in consequences. In that case, the following first premise holds: the murderer and the attempted murderer are equally blameworthy. Plug in the principle of proportionality, namely that people, or one implication of which is that people who are equally blameworthy should be punished equally, and you immediately get that what we want is the same criminal punishment for murder and for attempted murder. That's a very clear move. Notice, though, that even that kind of clear move requires both premises, and in particular, it requires the proportionality requirement. So if it wasn't clear to you until a couple of minutes ago why we need bridge principles, it should be clear to you now. The argument, if you take away premise 2, is no longer valid, right? The argument requires both the claim about moral luck and also the point about the relation between moral luck and criminal punishment. Of course, you could take a similar argument in the opposite direction. For instance, you may think that the murderer is more blameworthy than the attempted murderer. Namely, that you may assume that there is moral lack in consequences, at least in these cases. Then you may plug in a principle of proportionality, and you may justify the conclusion that the murderer should be punished more severely. So here's one really natural way in which the moral luck discussion is relevant to discussions within legal theory, namely if you already adopt something like a proportionality bridge principle. If the proportionality requirement, or a strong version thereof, is true, then the moral luck debate sort of influences immediately and almost exclusively to the discussion of the criminal law of attempts. But assume for a second that the proportionality requirement is either false or at least limited, so that it's just about pro tanto justification. Other considerations may still be relevant and may be also defeated. In that case, we should talk about other considerations and whether they affect the purported distinction between the right criminal punishment for murder and for attempted murder, or more generally, for full offenses or for attempts. So now we can assume that there is no moral luck. Assume that in terms of blameworthiness alone, the murderer and the attempted murderer are alike. And so in terms of proportionality, they're also alike. But we want to check whether there are any other considerations counting in favor of punishing the murderer more. And that's important because at least the traditional way of the common law did include a much harsher punishment for full offenses than for attempts. Maybe at the end of the day, we want to reject that. But that's going to need some serious convincing. Let's see then. Are there any other considerations that count in favor of a distinction between the punishment for attempts and for full offenses? So people often mention something about deterrence, but actually it's not at all easy to fill in the details here. It's not easy because ex ante, before they actually perform the action, before they actually perform the crime, it seems like you deter someone equally by putting a high price on attempts and on full offenses. In fact, when they embark on the project, they don't really distinguish. They take it into account that they're going to succeed, or that's anyway a plausible view of it. So, but more sophisticated discussions of deterrence too, in economic analysis of criminal law, also show that it's not clear that there is anything here by way of a good reason to punish full offenses more seriously than attempts. Here's a consideration that I like. It does seem to count in favor of at least some difference. So suppose someone tries to kill someone else, misses, and now consider whether to shoot again. Of course, from a social perspective, you want to give them a strong incentive to desist, not to shoot again, not to commit another attempt. But if the punishment for murder and for attempt murder are the same, then they don't have such an incentive, because they have already committed attempted murder, and attempted murder carries the same punishment. In that case, they can sort of shoot another bullet for free. In fact, they may have a strong incentive to do so, because typically they'll take at least one witness out of the equation. So that does seem like, at least in some cases, give you some reason to punish for attempted murder less. Namely, you want to give criminals a motive to desist. But I don't think we should take that kind of considerations more seriously than it can be taken, namely for a very small, restricted subset of cases. And in fact, for those cases, we may be able to give the right incentive in other means too, by other doctrines of the criminal law or of the law of evidence. You may think that if they stop after the first bullet, we're going to infer that they weren't as serious about it to begin with, or give them some other way of a reduced sentence. So this, I think, does go some way towards justifying a distinction between punishment on attempts and on full offenses. Not that much, though. You can find in the literature more interesting kind of sophisticated, largely deterrence, but not quite deterrence arguments. So I just want to mention them real quickly here, and then you can read more about them if you want. So it turns out that there are interesting implications to the incentives not just on criminals, but also to the incentives of potential crimes victims to your policy of punishing attempts. And there's one line of thought in the literature that shows how, at least given some plausible empirical background assumptions, if you insist on punishing for attempts less than you do for full offenses, you give more efficient incentives to potential crimes victims. So that's one line. The other is by David Lewis, one of my favorite philosophers of all time. That's his picture over there, which in a very well-known, really clever paper called something like the punishment that leaves something to chance, argues that there is no moral difference between the murderer and the attempted murderer, but still you can think of the differential punishment that the common law has always administered in these cases as a kind of randomizing device. It's really a kind of lottery with regard to whom you're going to punish more and whom you're going to punish less. And there are some good reasons and not very strong reasons against going for this kind of punishment lottery. So there are these kinds of considerations as well. There may be others, and there are more in the literature. It's not clear that many of them actually can resist criticism. Okay, so this was the central case of the law of attempts and the question whether we should punish differentially for an attempt and for a full offense. But there are many, many other cases. This is just a central case. There are many other cases in the criminal law. For instance, any offense at all that includes something about consequences already incorporates something about luck. So it's already so the questions of legal luck and of moral luck are already relevant. This is very clear in cases of criminal negligence, but not just in offenses of criminal negligence. Consequences, a causation requirement more generally, is extremely central to many cases in criminal law. And there may be other cases that are not as straightforward, but still. So for instance, as a part of the, I guess in the last few decades, the victims' rights movement in the criminal law, judges, sometimes juries, I think more often judges, often have in front of them statements detailing the effect on the victims or on the victims' families of the crime. But that, of course, gives even more weight to consequences, most of which lie outside the offender's control. So that's a way of actually increasing the effect of legal luck. And if you believe that there is no moral luck, and if you believe that there, to an extent, shouldn't be legal luck in criminal law either, perhaps because of a proportionality requirement, then you should rethink at least these aspects of the victims' rights movement. Of course, when it comes to circumstantial and constitutive moral luck, criminal law is just full of it all the time. Once again, the law punishes for what people do, not for what they would have done had the circumstances been different. And in those cases, the law doesn't even feel any discomfort about doing that, perhaps unlike cases of murder and attempted murder. Okay, so these are cases in criminal law. But there's legal luck everywhere else as well. Clearly, there's legal luck in the case of torts. In fact, when it comes to the case of torts, everything we just said about criminal law is probably true as well, because of the similarities or many similarities between tort law and criminal law. Certainly, causation is every bit as central in tort law as it is in criminal law. Notice, though, that it's not clear that the same bridge principles apply. So we may think that a proportionality requirement is extremely plausible when it comes to criminal law, but doesn't seem that good an idea when it comes to tort law. If so, the relation between moral luck and legal luck is going to be much more direct, much more immediate in the case of criminal law than it is in the case of tort law. There are also other sources of luck in torts. For instance, who your tortfeasor is not under your control, at least in most cases, and that of course seriously affects their ability to pay, and so how much by way of money you will actually get at the end of a long tort procedure. Although this may be thought of not as a case of legal luck, but a case of plain luck that has legal implications. As I already mentioned, the discussion from criminal law seems relevant, but doesn't apply directly because of the possible different bridge principles, and in particular, differential plausibility for the proportionality requirement. So these are the two cases that people discuss in the literature of legal luck, crim law and tort law. But as you can find out for yourself, cases in which your legal status may depend on things that lie outside your control are everywhere, and they may be problematic everywhere too, although whether they are will depend on the plausibility of the specific versions of the bridge principles. Okay, so finally, a thought going in the opposite direction. So far, what we've been doing is discussing the philosophical question of moral luck and checking whether it has any implications to discussions of the desirability of legal luck. But perhaps we can proceed in the opposite direction as well. So consider the following argument then. Start with the same proportionality requirement that we've been discussing so far, but now plug in the following as a premise, which does seem intuitively plausible to many of us, not to all of us though. The murderer should be punished more seriously than the attempted murder. Well, if the proportionality requirement is true and the murderer should be punished more seriously than the attempted murderer, what follows is that the murderer is more blameworthy, namely that there is moral luck. So to the extent that you're really confident in something like premise 2, perhaps you can argue from plausible claims about the law to interesting conclusions about morality. I'm not sure how plausible this is. Maybe this is because I'm not sure that premise 2 is as plausible as I just made it sound. Or perhaps somewhat less directly, but perhaps somewhat more deeply and maybe more interestingly. Perhaps we can offer a debunking explanation of some of the pro-moral luck intuitions as really confused intuitions about the law or about other appropriate kinds of social responses, but not directly about moral blameworthiness. If that's what we say, then it's possible that their role as evidence for moral luck, rather than for other things in the vicinity, is seriously diminished, maybe even debunked entirely. Obviously, the moral discussion, the discussion within moral philosophy of moral luck doesn't need to have any legal implications in order to be interesting. It's interesting enough as it is. Still, it does seem to be even more interesting, and interesting in more ways, and perhaps more ways that are relevant to you and me, if it also has these legal implications.